Well, hello, everybody, and good afternoon and a very good evening on this August occasion to all our viewers that are dialed in. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to kick off the opening plenary session of the Nudge Forum by introducing Professor Abhijit Banerjee. Professor Banerjee is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at MIT and the co-winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2019 for research on poverty alleviation. He is the co-founder of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, a research affiliate of Innovations for Poverty Action, a member of the Consortium on Financial Systems and Poverty, and serves on the Academic Advisory Board of Plaksha University. He's also the co-author of two very topical books, Poor Economics and Good Economics for Hard Times. So before I hand over to Professor Banerjee, I should mention we have about 45 minutes set aside for this session. Dr. Banerjee will be speaking for about half that time, after which we'll have a conversation with him. So welcome, and over to you, Professor Banerjee.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And happy Independence Day to all the Indians who are on this on Zoom and listening otherwise. I think before one gets into what's right and what's wrong with India, it's worth saying that the Indian project is a remarkable project. It's one of the bravest adventures in state building that we know of. If you read what people were saying about India when India was proposed or sort of mooted, there was lots of negativity, I would say, and it's not entirely. It's not entirely unreasonable, and you might say that's sort of what makes the project, in a sense, remarkable. Winston Churchill, who was really not a friend of India's, said India is merely a geographical expression. It is no more a single country than the equator. It's, after all, a nation of hundreds of languages, 23,000 dialects, many religions, so many sources of disagreement, conflict, and basically Churchill had predicted without the British, India will fall back quickly into the barbarism and privations of the Middle Ages. There was others who were also negative. For example, the fact that India was one country which went to universal adult franchise directly from no democracy whatsoever, and at a time when India had 20% literacy, and based the various leading scholars of democracy, Robert Dow was probably the 20th century's kind of the leader in democratic theory, said India is a leading contemporary exception to democratic theory. India is not supposed to be a democracy. It's not supposed to work as a democracy. If you add to that the fact there's a long history of caste-based oppression, one of the most brutal systems of discrimination known to man, you see why people were holding their breath when the Indian project was mooted. And for a long time, I felt that, maybe this is a project that's going to collapse on its own weight. It's just too many divergences, too much illiteracy, too many conflicts, and yet, after 73 years, we know that hasn't happened. We're still a nation, fraying a bit, but still at the edges, but maybe still a nation. Still a democracy, at least in the sense that elections are held on time, voting is mostly free, and those who get the most votes win the seat. So as the recent events highlight, there was much to be concerned about. we have poverty between 1993 and 2011, but maybe poverty has been going up in the last few years. That's a concern. Caste wage gaps have shrunk very substantially since the 1980s, which reflects an equally strong convergence in the caste education gaps. If you compare that with, for example, the United States, where the black-white gap has remained stubbornly large. So in some ways, all of these things are achievements. And the one achievement I wanted to, and I will emphasize, and that's sort of the meat of my talk, is the fact that even as a very poor country, even in 1950, we were a moral and an intellectual leader in the world. And the part that I want to spend my time talking about is our intellectual leadership. I want to start by telling you a story. In, I think, 1953, or Chu Enlai came to India. Chu Enlai was the Prime Minister of China, came to India, and his primary interest was to learn about how Indians did surveys. He went to the Indian Statistical Institute and spent hours there interrogating everybody about how surveys were done, because he wanted to replicate that in China. That's not an accident. India was, in fact, remarkably, at this point, when I mean by intellectual leader, is literally that in this particular form of rigorous policy thinking, India was maybe the world leader, certainly a world leader. I mean, there was this Indian Statistical Institute was a really top institution in that general area of statistics, data science, as it used to be, with people like C.R. Rao, Raghuraj Bahadur, Rajchandra Bose, Somarendranath Roy. These were all absolutely top people in the field, and it attracted, like, for example, the great Russian mathematician Kolmogorov would come and spend months there. J.B.S. Holden, who was one of the great British biologists and one of the founders of the field of biometrics, spent his last years working at the Indian Statistical Institute, etc. So there was really a sense of extraordinary quality of intellectual quality there. The National Sample Survey, which Chu Enlai was so interested in, was the first example of a scientifically designed, nationally represented household survey anywhere. I mean, anywhere, not in the developing, but anywhere. And it remains the model for household surveys everywhere in the developing world. It's most surveys, the World Bank's Living Standards Measurement Survey, is actually the NSS mildly translated into different contexts. The CSO, the Central Statistical Organization, was the pioneer in how to estimate GDP in a developing country. There's a thesis by Moni Mohan Mukherjee under Simon Kuznets, Nobel Prize winner at Harvard, on how to compute how GDP in a poor country. So these were all really pioneering steps. We've sort of forgotten this history. I really wanted to spend a minute or two on it, because it seems to me that it's an history that we should take pride in. To continue a little bit in economics, the integration between high economic thinking and practical policy thinking was happening as much anywhere in the world as in Delhi, where Jagdish Bhagawati, Amartya Sen, T.N. Srinivasan, but also people who maybe we have forgotten now, but really great figures like Sukhumai Chakraborty, Padma Desai, Raj Krishna, and of course Manmohan Singh, were all there at the same time. They were teaching, they were doing research, they were working in policy space. A lot of the early empirical research in development economics, my field, it came out of India. Pranab Bardhan, Ashok Rudra, T.N. Srinivasan were some of the great figures in this enterprise. Mahalanobis and Pitambar Pant were great bureaucrats, in a sense, leaders of connecting policy to uh, to sort of research, and many and an enormous number of scholars from all over the world worked on India. And my MIT colleague Dick Eckes thinks of himself still, he's now 90, thinks of himself as an India scholar. He spent his early years working in the Planning Commission. So there's just really a remarkable level of, he spent months in Delhi working at the Planning Commission. So this was just a different world where we were really the intellectual hub of a particular kind of research. And that particular sort of elite status, I'm afraid we have lost. Now, it's still true that there are remarkable things that keep coming out of India. I think the one example that I always go back to is the remarkable survey that Pratham does called ASAR, the education survey that they do every year nationwide, measuring representative at the district level, measuring educational performance. That's a survey that now has been imitated in many countries, in Pakistan, in East Africa, in West Africa. It's something that is a tool that many countries have adopted. It was invented in India in the early 2000s. In many ways, if one takes a slightly broader view, I think the thinking on how to design welfare schemes, the design of NREGA, of the Food Security Act, these were also domains where research and policy making met. These are two of the world's largest welfare schemes. Maybe the two largest welfare schemes in the world are the NREGA and the NFSA, the National Food Security Act. I think even more recently, the building of the Aadhaar infrastructure, whatever its imperfections, conceptually, the idea that this can be a way of transforming welfare payments, the idea of using the NDA government's idea of using the JAM Trinity, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and mobile infrastructure to transform money. All of these were innovative ideas, globally innovative ideas. So, and for our own work in JPAL's work, the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Club work, India is the biggest country. We work with state governments, all over the country, across the political spectrum. We worked with Mr. Modi in Gujarat. We worked with Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal. We worked with Nitish Kumar in Bihar. We worked with Amarinder Singh in Punjab. We worked with the current Haryana government. We worked with the Delhi government. We worked with the Tamil Nadu government. We worked with the UP government. So in some ways, there is still receptivity to research at a level and an appreciation of quality, which is extremely gratifying and helpful. But that said, I would say we are no longer where we were, and you can see that in some ways in the reaction to the way India is now reported on in the West, which is often, I would say, sometimes cruel, but often not unfair, just to point out that, for example, the NSS, which I was talking about with so much pride, is no longer available. The 2017-18 NSS, it had an employment round which the government disagreed with and suppressed, and junk basically, and then the consumption data, which showed that maybe poverty was actually rising slightly, is no longer available to us. The GDP data, again, there seems to be constant revisions in how it's done, and to the point where the previous chief economic advisor, Arvind Subramaniam, has said that the growth rate is probably half of what is being claimed. All kinds of, there was supposed to be an NSS data that was going to help us revise the GDP. Instead, the government rejected that data. So we're in a place where very little information about India, hard information, is coming out. And that's frightening. Some of this is, I think, genuine problems in the NSO and CSO, which we should have fixed many years ago, has been pointed out by many people for many years and has not been fixed. And I think that's in some ways the pressure is not a bad thing, but I think there is also just, I think, lack of prioritization, which has allowed the National Statistical Commission, which was set up, I think, 15 years ago, the bill for it has not passed Parliament yet, because essentially it's not a priority for anybody. And so the kind of thing that can give priority to high quality data is just not happening. And I think in general, successive governments, not just this one, have been suspicious of losing control over the data. I think the consequences of a lack of a culture of scientifically informed policymaking were all too evident in the recent pandemic. The lockdown, in my opinion, and I think opinion, was too early. We did it too quickly. Before enough, if we knew that the lockdown would only last for a short amount of time, we might have wanted to have so lockdown, which was when the disease was really had already reached a lot of people, to lock down then, because then you would slow it down when it's actually needed to slow down. We did instead, we moved very early and then opened up very early, because you can't keep people locked down for a very long time. And that created, I think, worse outcomes than would have been otherwise. We had not thought about the migrants, the way the lockdown was done, the fact that it was just shut down, the country was shut down in 4 hours notice, partly the thought of what the migrants will do had not been engaged with. And that's partly because we know so little about migrants. In fact, we have no survey that actually now that migration is a matter of 10 or 20 or 30 million or even more people, we just don't have any sense of how they live, how many of them are there, where they live. A lot of them, the problem was partly that the migrants had just no place to live. They always lived in the construction site, and when the construction site was closed, they just had no place to live. And that kind of thing needs to be documented. We need an intellectual basis for dealing with these problems. If we don't have the intellectual basis, we're going to keep making these mistakes. By the time the migrants problem was fully recognized, the migrants had lived in those cities for a long enough time, in Bombay, in Delhi, where they were getting COVID. And that meant that when they went back, and they went back in crowded trains and crowded trucks, they were spreading the disease to more people. The fact that we keep till the end of July, there was just the head of ICMR was declaring that there's no community transmission in India. Some of the states were not. There were, Kerala and West Bengal had already admitted there was community transmission. But the fact that there was that's just unscientific. There's no possible way that could be true. So I feel that that's a sign of a country which is no longer as clear about its commitment to a knowledge-based, science-based policy thinking as it was, as we started. I think in some ways we made many mistakes, and this is not to say that science always gets it wrong. I mean, clearly our planned economy was a disaster, but I think that we certainly the way we discovered it was a disaster was partly the work of people who were doing scientific work, like Bhagavati, like Srinivasan, like Padma Desai. And I think the fact that we like Raj Krishnan, there were many of these people were criticizing from the beginning or from very early years the way we were doing planning. So I think there's the fact there was an intellectual culture of engagement with the policy space where everybody appreciated quality thinking and precise precision and being right was very instrumental in the way India had evolved. And now I think that's a trend. So to end, I want to say the new economic education policy has just been announced, and its goal is to turn India into a vibrant knowledge hub. I quote. And I think and there are good ideas in the policy, certainly trying to attract world-class universities and to adopt their models of education. Both of those are good ideas. But I think more importantly, we have to have faith in knowledge, wherever it takes us. And that's not to say that the exact truth is always available to us. It's often elusive, but that's not a reason to stop paying attention to the available evidence. We have to have faith in those who produce knowledge. We can't just constantly question their motives. We can't say that if you are producing a piece of information that's sort of counter to what we believe, then you must have the wrong motives. We have to trust people. We need leadership at all levels to be about asking questions, asking the right questions. I think Nehru was famously someone who would ask difficult questions to his people, and then they would hunt around and find answers. And I think it's very important that it be about asking questions and not about pronouncing the truth. And we need a culture where being wrong is accepted, but being willfully blind is not. I think we have to allow people, I think part of engaging with knowledge is accepting the possibility of being wrong, but not the possibility of just looking the other way. And I think we need to, if we want to get there, if we want to make India go back to being an intellectual leader, we need to engage with these ideas. And I hope, and on this day, I wish for India that it regains its status as an intellectual leader in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee, for your insightful remarks. In the time that we have now remaining, if you don't mind, we'll switch over to a little bit of a Q&A and have a conversation using some of the questions that have come in from our audience. Now, for the audience, I see a lot of you popping questions in. I'd like to mention that we've had actually questions come in, not just today, but the last few days. So we've organized them into a few common themes, and we'll use those to have a conversation with Professor Banerjee. So kicking things off, Professor Banerjee, and since you talked about COVID a little bit, and the desirability of fact and science basis in decision making, the intervention to the crisis has varied a lot across countries. Are there any specific examples you would like to call out as being worthy of emulation, things that maybe we should have as part of a longer term conversation?
So I'll give you an example of a country which, I don't know exactly how, a country that nobody ever would mention, I think, normally as a leader. It's the country of Togo. Togo did three things that seem right. One is it didn't, when so many other countries were going into lockdown, it didn't go into lockdown, it waited. It eventually, the capital, there was a lockdown in the capital, but it waited a long time. Second, it announced that everybody will get a cash transfer. And so third, it used a phone-based infrastructure that it had already set up, which we haven't yet managed to get to send the cash transfer. And as a result, there was no panic. They managed to control the process much better. And it's a sort of unsung story because it's a very small African country with, I guess no particular. I mean, I don't think people expected it would be an outlier, but it was, and in some ways, I'm always impressed by those kinds of examples. So that's an example of a country which basically, in my view, got it much more right than most countries.
That is truly an unusual example and a good one. Any other example of an economy or a society that you would like to mention?
I think many countries did I think, I think, for example, in many ways, what they did eventually in Dharavi was pretty impressive. They did get identify everybody who was infected and take them out. They took them out of Dharavi. The reason why Dharavi managed to control its infection rates was because they managed to take people out and put them into hospitals or in community care or somewhere, so that they didn't spread the disease. In that kind of crowded environment, would have been very difficult to manage otherwise. And I think they did an impressive job, actually.
Okay, thank you. Taking maybe a step back, right, and then looking at this more structurally. I remember a talk you gave recently. I think it was at the LSE, where you talked about the fact that the crisis has exposed the fragility of our systems, both economic and social. So, as an economist, do you think that that data is self-evident, or we also need to look at the world differently? We need to augment our lens to better capture, highlight this fragility, this structural weakness as a way of helping address it.
Well, I already sort of was getting into that, which is that I think one place, for example, our data system has no record of migrants. The way we collect data, both the NSS and the census, essentially ask people who, if you happen to live on a construction site, you don't exist. You are only counted as a citizen by reference to your parents might mention you as someone who is away but is from this household, and that's how you get counted. And if in the NSS, what it does is ask people how many people ate food with you in the last month or something, and there you just don't get counted. So it's very much a way of our entire data system assumes that people live at home. Our welfare system assumes people live at home. You cannot get PDS. The government is now talking about a portable PDS, and that's a great idea. But I don't know why, but it's a fact that we never engage with just how many people are migrants that made it possible to not have to have a domicile-based system. Domicile-based system makes no sense in an economy where, tens of, maybe even 50 million people are migrants at any one point of time. It just makes no sense. We just don't know how many migrants there are. And then, because we don't know that, we don't make policy that accommodates them.
Mm-hmm. Fair point. Maybe now switching out of the here and now and looking at the world a little bit more long term and going back to the research, I think that you're famous for. A lot of your studies highlight the fact that small nudges, as you call them, and this word is particularly one we can relate to, that small nudges can have a disproportionate impact, and sometimes far more than a conventional or potentially more research intensive program. Right? And I think you give the example of how a kg of dal can impact favorably immunization rates. Right? And so, as economists or policymakers or NGOs, how should we orient ourselves to thinking and innovating around what I would say are small, meaningful interventions, sort of identifying that nudge as our primary response or our first response as we think about it.
So I'll give you an example. We just did a randomized control trial in West Bengal, where before we did that, we did a survey, and in the survey we asked people, and what the respondents on the phone survey, you know, what are they supposed to do? And most people knew the answers. It was not that they didn't know that they're supposed to wear masks, they're not supposed to go out, they're supposed to wash hands, etc., etc. Most of them knew, like a very, very large majority knew the answer. Then you could ask a different set of people, did you actually do that? And of course, most people were not doing any of those things. Okay, so there were no, masks people were kind of wearing, but not washing hands. Maybe sometimes, and not going out. Yeah, none of them were. So it's easy to send messages to people and assume that they will stick. Now, I was persuaded by friends to actually make a video where I sent a message to, as somebody who happens to be now quite well known in West Bengal, I sent a video message to 25 million people. Control group of 3 million people. And then we can measure again, and that has large impact on whether they go out of the village, etc., or they, how many times they wash their hands. So even I think it's one obvious thing is, let's not assume anything is obvious. Things are obvious, people know it, but they know it in half their brain, and then they hold it there. They don't actually engage with it. And if you keep kind of the right way of nudging them, then they might actually implement. That's an example, a very recent example on COVID.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, the questions are flooding in, so if you don't mind, I'm going to pop a few more to you. Here's one. Has the nature of poverty changed, in your opinion, since independence?
Absolutely. I mean, it is clear that right now, almost, the people who were really poor at independence mostly don't exist anymore. The people, the children who had no clothes, who would walk around my neighborhood in Kolkata. I grew up in a very, we were perfectly middle class, but we lived in a very low income neighborhood. And the kids most kids in our areas walked around till the age of 6 with no clothes on, with their belly sticking out, their red hair, your typical sign of malnutrition. That you don't see. Malnutrition is one of the things which has actually been improving. In the last 10 years, we have seen quite a substantial dent in malnutrition, remarkably enough. So it's 23% reduction, I think, in stunting. Quite big numbers. So it's one of these things that I feel has changed. The poorest of the poor don't exist anymore, in a sense, thankfully. There are still people who should not have to live the way they live. Certainly, living in Dharavi is extraordinary. A number that really I find hard to believe, but is claimed is a life expectancy of a Dharavi resident is still 43 years. A male Dharavi resident is 43 years. That's a number that is extraordinarily awful, and we should not tolerate it. It shouldn't be true. In any reasonable world, it should not be true. But it's been given that in the rest of India, 67 years. It's where we are, and so I think that things have gotten better, but of course that hasn't solved many problems.
Yeah. If I may now move to the migrant population, because that's been one of the things you spoke of. One of the questions that has come in is, To what extent should the government engage with civil society? For example, how can government and civil society think about and understand the migrant population?
Well, I think that I think we should start by doing a systematic survey of,
Mhm.
where we track people from when somebody says, my son is in, somebody in Odisha says, my son is in Chennai. It's typically possible. We've done this actually. We can get the phone number, we can track him down, and we need a nationwide tracking system where you know where he's coming from, where he is, track him down. It's very hard to find these people otherwise because they live in unorthodox places, like sleep under a truck or something sometimes. Because so you have to find a way of calling them and then finding them and going and talking to them. But I think this survey at the national scale, we need a kind of order of magnitude sense of how many people there are, how do they live, etc. It's just, I think without that, we can't really engage. We can just make up stories. We really need to have some idea of just how do these people, where do they spend the night, how much, how do they send money home, etc., etc. There's just a bunch of stuff that we don't know.
Thank you. This one is more, if I can call it, from one of our younger viewers, because a lot of the folks who are dialed in, I think, are in their 20s. And then this person asks, how do we motivate the youth in India who are seeking better opportunities?
I feel that, in a sense, my worry with is, I'll tell you something that's a fact that's worries me. If you look at the NSS data, when NSS data was available till the last round, but this was true in the 80s, it was true in the 90s, the 2000s, the same fact is true. Which is that if you look at the median, not median, the 25-year-old Indian, lots of them are not in the labor force yet. Lots of them are saying they're taking courses, they're doing something. Now, by the age of 30, that vanishes. All male Indians are employed at 30. And really, 2% is the unemployment rate, I think. But at 25, that number is very different. Mm-hmm. And that, given that our population has a youth bulge, that has large consequences for, GDP, for example, because a bunch of people are not working. Now, why are they not working? Partly, I think it's the fact that they have too conservative aspirations. They want government jobs. We've sort of seen other evidence, I don't have the time to go into it, suggesting that, people are obsessed with government jobs. They sacrifice, I think, many years of their life in the pursuit of government jobs and then don't get them because there are few government jobs, in fact, and then eventually get something and do it. But I think in some ways, this obsession with government jobs, the security of the whatever, the fact that you cannot be fired, etc., this is in a sense is holding back our youth. I think we need to be more adventurous. Think, of. I think the private sector and starting your own business, all of those are different options. But if we stay obsessed with the government jobs, then we're going to handicap ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I now get to what I'm thinking is possibly the last question we get to ask you. How do we improve implementation of policies, be they related to livelihood, food security, education, or health? How do we improve the implementation at the grassroots level?
I think some of the policies, it's worth being clear that many of the policies have improved. They improved. Narega, when it started, the leakage rates were 50%. You ask somebody, if you match the numbers on how much money was sent versus how much people report in household surveys, the number was 50%. That number quickly went up to 80%. So likewise, PDS clearly has improved over the last 10 years. So, or, since the NFSA was passed, I think it's improved. So it's not, one should not start with the presumption that it's all bad, because then it's paralyzing. I think we should start with the idea that improvements are possible. They happen. Very large-scale improvements are possible.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I think this is saying. These are the two biggest programs, and both of them have improved enormously. So I think lots of money has got to people where it wasn't getting to people. And so I think first point, let's be positive. It can be done. Second is, I think it would be useful to not have so many schemes. I think we have too many schemes, very hard to have either civil society's attention on 370 schemes or the government's attention on 300. I think basically very few schemes really matter, but a lot of the other ones are sources of leakage. So, in terms of actual welfare, the Indira Awas Yojana is another one that matters. And I think eventually the cash transfers to the farmers, that's another one that matters. But is the new cash transfer to farmers? But it's not that many other schemes that really do anything. It's just they're like a bit like an afterthought, and that afterthought then drags on and wastes resources. So I think if we had fewer schemes and focused on a few schemes but doing them better and better, I think we could get there.
Well, thank you. I have to tell you that the questions are pouring in. There's still about 60 that I haven't gotten to, but we're almost out of time, and I know it's pretty late in the day where you are. So I'd say let's conclude our session, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time. I know you're a busy man, for taking the time to do this and be a part of our event. We greatly appreciate having you here and learning from your work. So thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.